Is supplementing with collagen worth it for the 50 plus crowd? What are the differences between men and women in terms of proper nutrition and building muscle? I'm going to give you the research answers, and then I'm going to give you my if you injected me with truth serum answer. What are the benefits of fiber besides its benefits on gut health? Do any non-diabetics ever need to worry about sugar consumption if overall calories are controlled? What sorts of things negatively affect muscle growth? I mean, there's a lot of things that negatively affect muscle growth. Welcome back to the Dr. Layne Norton podcast. I'm your host, Layne Norton, and in this episode, we are doing another Q&A. Now, I really enjoy doing these because typically I can be really long-winded, and it forces me to try to shorten my diatribes into something usable for you guys. So I asked you guys what burning questions you had, and I picked out my top questions to answer, so we'll go through them now. Is supplementing with collagen worth it for the 50 plus crowd? So collagen supplementation has been something that I've been quite skeptical of. I'm going to give you the research answers, and then I'm going to give you my if you injected me with truth serum answer. So in research studies, in human randomized control trials, and you guys know how big I am on those when I scream, human randomized control trials, they are the gold standard, but they're not infallible. And there are quite a few human RCTs showing benefits for pain, for recovery from injury, for possible prevention of injury, for skin elasticity, hydration. And so that would seem relatively clear-cut, and it would seem to make sense as well because, okay, well, collagen helps make up connective tissue, and if you take more collagen, then you have better connective tissue. The problem is we don't have a good mechanism to explain how that works, because when you take in collagen, what you are taking in is an intact protein. And it's not like you take in collagen and then it reaches your connective tissue as the intact collagen and just inserts itself. That's not how that works. Collagen, which is simply a type of protein, I believe it's a triple helix. So basically like these three strands of protein wrap around each other to form the collagen protein. Collagen, like any protein, when you ingest it, is going to go through the stomach, which has 6 molar concentrated hydrochloric acid. That is going to cause that three-dimensional shape of that protein to start to unfold through a process called denaturation, that those high levels of acid are going to unfold that protein. Then you have digestive enzymes in the stomach like pepsin and pepsinogen, which are going to start to chop up some of those proteins into shorter proteins. Then when it reaches the duodenum of the small intestine, you're going to have all your pancreatic enzymes and your trypsins, chymotrypsins, all your proteases are going to come in and really start chopping those protein up to basically you're going to be left with individual amino acids, dipeptides, which is 2 amino acids, and tripeptides, which is 3 amino acids. That is the vast majority of what gets absorbed into your bloodstream. And so you're not absorbing intact collagen, you're absorbing amino acids. And so could those amino acids then be reincorporated into connective tissue? Sure. But we know for skeletal muscle, it doesn't really work that way. If you give somebody, just amino acids, it doesn't necessarily increase their muscle mass. Yet, yes, we know leucine, the amino acid leucine, will stimulate muscle protein synthesis, which may help with protein deposition, but you can get that through just eating enough protein in a day. So really what you're trying to do is if you really wanted to improve connective tissue, you have to increase connective tissue synthesis to get more of these amino acids deposited in your connective tissue, because just taking in collagen is not going to guarantee that they get deposited in connective tissue, because again, what your circulation, what your bloodstream and your tissues are seeing is not collagen, they're seeing amino acids. And so the question should be, does this increase connective tissue synthesis? Because if it increases connective tissue synthesis, then yes, it could have benefits. But we now have multiple very well done studies from one of the top protein metabolism labs in the world, Luc Van Loon's lab, that show that collagen supplementation, anywhere from 15 to 25 grams at a sitting, does not increase connective tissue synthesis more than whey protein. I'll say that again. The research shows very clearly that collagen does not increase connective tissue synthesis more than whey protein. They're equivalent. So if collagen has a benefit, it's simply a benefit of protein. It's not a benefit unique to collagen. Well, Lane, how do you explain these human randomized control trials showing these benefits? Well, a lot of those benefits are based on very subjective measures used in these studies. And there was a recent meta-analysis that looked at the effects of collagen. This was on like skin hydration and elasticity. When they did the overall meta-analysis, they found a benefit to collagen supplementation. But then they did sub-analysis, which means when you do sub-analysis, you're separating out the analysis into certain traits. And so they separated out into studies funded by industry and pharmaceuticals and studies that were not funded by industry and pharmaceuticals. And they found that when they did the sub-analysis of the studies that were not funded by companies that sold collagen products, there was no effect of collagen on skin hydration or elasticity. The research suggests collagen could have a benefit. But if you inject me with True Serum, I will tell you I don't think it does anything. I've had people fight with me about this online. If I had to make a case for collagen, I would say, well, it is high in the amino acid proline, which is important for forming collagen. Proline is a very uniquely structured amino acid. The high proline levels in collagen allow it to have this kind of triple helix structure to it. But again, you have to increase connective tissue synthesis to get these amino acids deposited in these tissues. And if you're not increasing connective tissue synthesis, then by what mechanism is collagen causing this? Because your body is not seeing collagen, it's seeing the individual amino acids. And again, the research pretty clearly shows it doesn't increase connective tissue synthesis more than other forms of protein. So when it comes to collagen, I personally would save your money. I don't think it does anything. And then if we talk about muscle building, it is literally the worst protein in existence for building muscle. It is so low in leucine, so low in branched amino acids. Most protein sources, I'm not aware of any protein source that when you give 30 grams of it at a sitting, that it doesn't increase muscle protein synthesis. Collagen is the only protein I am aware of in research studies where you give a 25 to 30 gram dose of it and it does absolutely nothing for muscle protein synthesis. So I do have a pretty strong opinion on this. Maybe it will change, but I think collagen is a complete waste of money. And I think companies love it because they can market it to women. Collagen in particular is very heavily marketed towards women, and women spend more money than men do, just in general. Women are more likely to buy, they're more likely to be return customers, and so companies like it because they can market this stuff to women. I'll be completely honest, people have asked me, hey Lane, you're an investor in David Protein, it has collagen protein in it. The collagen protein in David Protein is done for mouth feel, not as for any particular benefit. It's done because it helps the bar taste better, have better mouthfeel. And it's a relatively small amount of collagen. And the PDCAS, the protein digestibility corrected amino acid score, which is the gold standard for scoring the quality of a protein, is a perfect PDCAS of 1.0. So basically, correcting for digestibility, the amino acid composition of the David bar is as good as you can get. What are the benefits of fiber besides its benefits on gut health? So I hear this a lot from carnivores. Well, I poop just fine without fiber. Okay, cool. Yeah, well, quite a bit of fecal matter is not fiber. It's from turnover of intestinal cells. Now, fiber will absolutely help you go to the bathroom, poop. It adds bulk to stool. It pulls water into the GI tract, and that water plus the bulk reduces the difficulty or the work that your intestinal tract has to do to use peristalsis to move that food mass, or what ends up being called chyme, through the digestive tract. So the way your digestive tract works is it's basically a tube from your mouth to your butthole that uses peristalsis, which are essentially wave-like contractions, to move that digesta down the tract. Now, if you have a small bolus of food, if it doesn't have much bulk to it, the intestine has to work harder with those contractions to move it. Whereas if you have more bulk, it's filling out more of it, it's easier to get the food through your digestive tract. So yes, it does have benefits for stool elimination. But that is the last reason why you should eat fiber. You should eat fiber because in research studies, getting over, say, like 21, 22 grams of fiber per day reduces your risk of mortality, reduces your risk of cardiovascular disease, reduces your risk of cancer, reduces your risk of, I think, kidney disease, reduces your risk of type 2 diabetes, reduces your risk of obesity. I have not come across a study yet where dietary fiber didn't have a positive impact on health outcomes. And it seems to be very, very consistent across different populations, whether healthy or non-healthy or diseased. Dietary fiber helps. Now, there are two basic dietary fiber types. There's what's called insoluble or non-fermentable fiber, and there is soluble or fermentable fiber. And it's what it sounds like. So soluble will dissolve in water. It can also be fermented by the gut microbiota, and they produce short-chain fatty acids from that. And soluble fiber is one of the main, if not the main, fuel for most of the gut microbiome. And by giving it soluble fiber, these bacteria can produce these short-chain fatty acids like butyrate and propionate. And these short-chain fatty acids can be reabsorbed through the portal vein of the liver into circulation, and they appear to have a myriad of health benefits, including reducing inflammation, improving metabolic health, improving insulin sensitivity, possibly having anti-obesity benefits as well. And so those are the benefits you can get from soluble fiber. It also tends to bind and lower cholesterol and can lower LDL cholesterol, which is a risk factor for cardiovascular disease. Insoluble fiber, which are fibers like hemicellulose and cellulose, these are fibers that do not dissolve in water, and they're not really fermentable. The gut microbiota don't really use them for fuel. There's some evidence that they can be used to a small degree, but they're not a main source of fuel or even a major source of fuel. At least we don't think so. And so insoluble fiber is what adds bulk to stool. It's mostly just eliminated through your feces, but it reduces the risk of colon cancer quite a bit and reduces the risk of diverticulitis. Diverticulitis is when your intestine develops kind of like an outpouching where food can get, instead of being like kind of smooth, it can start to pouch out and food can get trapped in there. Foods like seeds and small things. And that can create a huge inflammatory response. My dad had diverticulitis about like 17 years ago, and he had like 103, 104 degree fever. He was in a ton of pain. It was not a very fun experience for him. And so one of the risk factors for diverticulitis is low insoluble fiber intake, because if you don't have enough bulk in your stool or in your digesta, like we were talking about, the thought is your intestine has to work harder in those contractions, and that can create one of those outpouchings where food can get trapped and cause an inflammatory response. So fiber is all good stuff. The research clearly shows basically like a linear benefit going up to like 20 grams of fiber per day. And then after you get to 20 grams of fiber per day, it kind of starts to tail off the benefits, but it still appears to have benefits that are a dose response. In fact, one meta-analysis, or I can't remember if it was a meta-analysis or a cohort study, but I'll cite it in the show notes, saw that for every 10 gram increase in fiber intake, there was a 10% decrease in the relative risk of mortality. So honestly, when people ask me about like longevity hacks, fiber is like the longevity hack. You get over 20 grams of fiber a day, you are reducing your risk of mortality, and mortality from the most common causes of death, which is cardiovascular disease and cancer. So eat your fiber. You know, guys, training is infinitely more complicated than nutrition. Where do you start? How many reps? How many sets? How close to failure? If you're confused about where to start with training, but you don't have the money to hire a coach to expertly guide you, check out the BioLane Workout Builder. When you subscribe to the BioLane Workout Builder, you get access to all my evidence-based programming. We have programs for every experience level, goal, and equipment availability. We even have programs for people with essentially no equipment and home gyms or hotel gyms or garage gyms, all the way up to fully equipped commercial gyms. We take all the guesswork out of the reps, sets, and intensity, but give you the flexibility to pick exercises that you prefer and have access to, while still making sure that the exercises that you may sub in are equally effective for building muscle. So if you're ready to take the guesswork out of your training, get strong, and build muscle, click the link in the show notes and sign up to the BioLane Workout Builder today. What is your opinion on turkesterone? So turkesterone, I believe, is derived or is in the family of ecdysterones, which are bug hormones that are involved in molting. And I always tell people it's so funny, having been in the fitness industry for about 25 years now, because there are so many supplements that get trotted out as new and exciting that are just zombie supplements that have been dug up from the graveyard so that supplement companies can trot them out like there's something novel. These are things like colostrum, HMB, pyruvate, I've seen this come back, as well as turkesterone and ecdysterone. So ecdysterone was being marketed in muscle magazines circa 1999, 2000, and the research data on it is very underwhelming. Now, there is a human randomized control trial with turkesterone where they showed increases in muscle mass. But here's the problem. I can always find a study for a supplement showing something. And when you have, and again, I'm big on outcome data, but when you have outcome data with no viable mechanism, then you have to be worried about the outcome data. Because if there's an outcome, there's absolutely a mechanism to explain it. But turkesterone and ecdysterone, they don't bind to the testosterone receptor. They don't increase endogenous testosterone. They don't affect muscle protein synthesis. I don't believe they affect muscle protein degradation. So how are they causing this increase in muscle mass? It doesn't make sense. There's no viable mechanism to explain it. And again, here's one thing that you can be sure of. The supplements that work have never gone out of style. They've never gone out of fashion. They've never fallen out of favor. Creatine has been popular since it was released because it works. Whey protein has been popular since it was released because it works. Caffeine has never gone out of style because it works. So when you see these supplements that continue to go in and out of style, that's a pretty good indication that they don't really work. And that is probably about 99% of supplements, to be honest with you. So I know there are some people who are very popular who are big proponents of turkesterone. Maybe I'm wrong, but in my personal opinion, based on the data I've seen, I am very unconvinced, and I believe it is a waste of time and money. Here's a non-nutrition question. How do you protect against burnout? You're such a high-achieving person. I think I've always been able to regulate that pretty well. Other areas of my life tend to burn me out more than my career or lifting. In fact, lifting has always been kind of what's protected me. I feel refreshed when I lift, but I think in general, the best way to protect against burnout is to make sure that you are consistently still doing things that you enjoy. And look, I have had to make changes in my life over time. Obviously I've always lifted because I've been competing in bodybuilding or powerlifting for the last 20 some years, but I also used to play fantasy football, and I used to play video games a lot, and I used to go fishing a lot, and I used to go competition pistol shooting a lot. Loved all those things. Pretty much the only thing left on that list that I do regularly is lifting. because now I'm a dad. I have these businesses that I work on a lot. I have a relationship, and, you can't do all the things all the time. And I think one of the things I've had to learn in my life, probably still haven't learned it to a great degree, but I've had to learn a little bit, is if you're trying to do all the things, there's things that are going to suffer. And you kind of got to pick where you put your time. And also, you want to live a life of balance. I don't want to, start a bunch of businesses, make a bunch of money, but then I was a horrible father. Like I don't want that. I wouldn't consider that successful. But there are seasons of life where your emphasis should shift. At any one time point, you are probably going to be unbalanced in your life. But the idea is that over the course of your life, you will have some balance between family, friends, hobbies, career, those sorts of things. When I think about when I was young in undergraduate and graduate school, my focus was basically lifting in school. I didn't do a whole lot else. And I didn't really feel burned out that often because I wasn't trying to be a big party person. Even in undergrad school, there were many Saturday nights I spent in studying. And some people will say, man, you missed out on a lot of stuff. Well, okay, but it gave me other opportunities I wouldn't have had if I hadn't have done that. And then when I was in graduate school, again, very focused on lifting in graduate school, and also started my coaching business during that time. So those were my areas of focus. So when I graduated grad school with my PhD, and I was still lifting, so I was still doing that. And I had my business, which I was still doing, but now I had more free time. So I got into more hobbies. That's where I started going fishing more often, going shooting more often. I got to have some me time. And it was great. Played fantasy football. And then my kids were born. And I still had these businesses and was actually like expanding them. I was still competing, but now I had kids as well. And so things started to have to get chopped off. And now I have my kids, I have businesses, I am in a long distance relationship. So there's not room for a lot of other things. And lifting is the only other thing I can really get in on a consistent basis. But I wouldn't say I really feel burnt out that often. Now, one, I do think I'm a little bit of I don't know if you want to call it a genetic freak or an aberration or whatever, but people who have been around me basically think I'm kind of like the Energizer Bunny. I'm very rarely like the first person to tap out on anything. I remember like 10 years ago, I was doing a seminar tour in Australia with a friend of mine, Ryan Doris, and we would basically have these camps where in the morning we'd do like a training session. Then we'd do seminars during the middle of the day, and then we'd do another training session at night. And then I would get home or back to our Airbnb, and I would do like another several hours of work doing client updates. And Ryan was like, bro, you're built different. And that never felt hard for me because I enjoyed all those things. So I'm maybe not the best person to talk to about burnout, but I think the first thing is realize that like being fatigued, feeling like things are hard, that is a normal process of like trying to get better at something. I think people are way too quick to throw the word burnout out there. If you're constantly getting burned out or feeling like you need a vacation or feeling like you need time off, it might be a sign that you're not doing what you really want to do. I'm not saying that you can like your job and still get burned out. I'm very sure of that. But if you're constantly feeling that way, then maybe you need to think about what would need to be true for you to not feel that way. And so for me, I tell people all the time, I have done it where I've worked, 12, 13 hours in a day. I've done that phase of my life. I don't really do that anymore. I work probably 6 hours a day, maybe 8, but I'm really freaking consistent with it. I'm really consistent with it. I'm doing that pretty much every day. And I'm not worried about the person who's pulling 12-hour days, because a lot of those people end up with burnout and then they're taking a week or two off. And I just kind of look at it as like, every time I read The Tortoise and the Hare, the tortoise always wins. I value consistency over intensity. And I think a lot of burnout can come from just trying to have too much intensity, trying to do too much in a short period of time. I'm not saying you can never have sprints. I've had those periods of time. But I see a lot of people, they treat it almost like they treat their nutrition really, really intense for a few weeks or a few months, and then they just completely fall off because you can't maintain it. And so, again, if you're always getting burnt out, you probably need to look at, like, what am I doing that's making me feel like that? Here's a question about my own training. Do you train other lifts besides the big three for powerlifting purposes? Yes, I train other lifts. But obviously, like, the competition lifts are squat, bench press, and deadlift. And if you want to get better at squatting, bench pressing, and deadlifting, you need to do squatting, bench pressing, and deadlifting as the primary focus of your training. But I still train other muscle groups. I still train my arms. I still train my calves, although some people might not believe that based on my calves, but I've never had good calves, for anybody wondering. But yes, I still do accessory movements. I'll still do variations of the main lifts. Like I'll do long paused bench press, or I'll do board presses, or I will do tempo training, or I'll do pause squats, or I'll do halting deadlifts, or deadlifts from boxes, or just different variations of the main lifts, just to reduce overall fatigue, but still get some stimulation in. And then I'll do accessory work. You know, I'm doing lat pull downs, I'm doing rows, I'm doing dumbbell presses for chest. I do belt squats, leg extensions, leg curls. I train kind of like a hybrid of powerlifting and bodybuilding. And I think that there's value in incorporating both. So yes, I do train things other than the big three, although the big three makes up the core of what I do with training. Do people in their 40s need more protein? That's a tough question to answer. The research studies that have been done on this topic usually are looking at people over 65 years of age versus young. And when you look at over 65 versus young, over 65, they do need more protein to get the same response of muscle protein synthesis. So as we age, and it starts around age 40, there is a progressive decline of muscle mass typically. Now, this is confounded by the fact that a lot of people after age 40 get very sedentary. And we do know that if you resistance train after age 40, you don't necessarily have this decline in muscle mass. But essentially, I believe sarcopenia is the progressive loss of muscle mass of about, I think it's like 0.5% per year or something like that of your skeletal muscle mass you lose if you don't do any interventions to try and stop it. And part of the thought process behind why this happens is your rates of muscle protein synthesis, your basal rates. So just kind of just sitting around in a post-absorptive state, your basal rates of muscle protein synthesis are the same as they are when they're young. But you don't respond as robustly to food with muscle protein synthesis as you do when you're young. And the research evidence suggests that people who are over age 65 need about, I think it's like 40% more essential amino acids to get the same stimulation of muscle protein synthesis as somebody who's young. Now, the important thing to point out here is you can get the same response of muscle protein synthesis as an elderly person as you can when you're young. You just need to take in more protein to get it. But 40 years old, I don't know if that demographic has been specifically studied. If I had to hazard a guess, I would say probably not. If you did, it's probably a very small amount more that you might want to take in. But if you're eating around 2 grams per kilogram of body weight, I mean, you're getting in enough. You're going to be fine. So, and that's around the 1 gram per pound of body weight sort of guideline that is very pervasive in the fitness industry. So if you're eating that much, you're going to be totally fine. And I really wouldn't worry about it that much. But yes, as you age, you will need more protein to get the same anabolic response to a meal compared to when you were young. Do any non-diabetics ever need to worry about sugar consumption if overall calories are controlled? Okay, here's where I say stuff that gets me in trouble, and people will take this clip and chop it up and say that I'm saying that people who have diabetes should consume sugar. If we look at human randomized control trials where they exchange sugar in a 1-to-1 ratio with other non-dietary fiber carbohydrate, there's no effect on fat loss, fat gain, body composition. It's the same. Sugar doesn't appear to change much. And it doesn't really appear to change much in terms of biomarkers of health, blood lipids, insulin sensitivity. Most of that stuff is a calorie issue. If you eat too many overall calories, you exceed your body's capacity to store them over time. Once fat cells reach a certain size, they become insensitive to insulin, and you cannot get as many nutrients into those fat cells or muscle cells. And those things start to spill over into the bloodstream, and that's when you develop insulin resistance, type 2 diabetes. And the low carb community in particular loves to make type 2 diabetics out to be this very unique population that need very special diet. They can't touch sugar. And the reality is, even high sugar diets have been shown that they can correct type 2 diabetes when there is weight loss involved. In fact, there is a very well-known study from the 1970s that I think was like the juice and white rice diet or something like that. Like, I think these people ate like 11 or 1200 calories a day, primarily from white rice, refined sugar, fruit juices, and bread, I want to say. Now, I would never tell somebody, hey, you should do this diet. But these people ate this diet. I think the average weight loss in the study, I think the average weight loss was like 130 pounds or something like that. And they all improved their health markers. And these were people, a lot of whom had type 2 diabetes. The point there is not that you should eat sugar if you have type 2 diabetes. I'm not saying that. In fact, I think sugar is a poor choice for a lot of reasons because it's not very satiating. But if you eat low enough calories and you lose body fat, you will get more insulin sensitive. It is an energy issue. It's not necessarily a sugar issue, because even if we look at studies where they induce type 2 diabetes, you can induce it by overfeeding fat. If you eat enough fat to where you're overeating calories, you can induce type 2 diabetes. So I want to be clear, sugar contributes to type 2 diabetes and contributes to the obesity epidemic because it's easy to overconsume the calories that are in sugary foods because they taste good and they don't have a great satiating effect. But the sugar, for example, that's in fruit, biochemically there's no difference between that and refined sugar, really. When it hits your body, it all gets cleaved into glucose and fructose. And yet, fruit doesn't cause obesity. Fruit intake is associated with lower rates of type 2 diabetes and obesity. So how? Well, it's because while fruit has sugar in it, it also has fiber, and it's typically quite satiating. So it's not an endocrine or physiological reason why sugar is contributing to the obesity crisis. It is simple. It tastes good, and it's easy to overconsume. And when people consume too many calories, regardless of the source, they gain body fat, and eventually, once they exceed their capacity to store nutrients in adipose tissue, they become insulin resistant. So the TLDR, short answer to that question is, I would not concern myself with sugar intake, although I would try to avoid foods that are low satiety, and many of those foods are high in sugar, if the goal is losing fat and being metabolically healthy. But I would focus more on your calorie intake and getting in enough total fiber. because if you're eating enough fiber, typically you're going to have to eat pretty nutrient-rich foods to do that. Are you looking to level up as a coach? I mean, really take things to the next level? My Physique Coaching Academy is what happens when you take college-level, research-based education and make it actually usable for coaches. Dr. Bill Campbell and I teamed up with our partners at Clean Health to bring you the most comprehensive, research-based, college-level education on how to coach muscle building, fat loss, and optimizing metabolism, and how to apply it practically to clients. This isn't bro science or surface level or influencer fluff. This is real science-based coaching that will separate you from the noise. If you're tired of guessing and you want to coach with confidence, check out the link in the show notes to enroll in Physique Coaching Academy. This is what the industry should have been offering all along, and I'm excited to share it with you. Let me be your professor. What are the differences between men and women in terms of proper nutrition and building muscle? It's going to be a very unpopular answer because women quite frequently are targeted by predatory marketing that basically says you are a unique snowflake and stuff that works for men doesn't work for you, so you need special programs. And then if we get into like the menopause and postmenopausal stuff, it's even more predatory. The research seems to be quite clear on this. While men and women have differences in their physiology, the way they respond to resistance training, cardiovascular exercise, is extremely similar. In fact, if we look at the resistance training literature, if you look at how much muscle men and women build in response to training, they actually build the same amount in terms of a percentage of their starting lean mass. So what I mean is if a female starts at 40 kilos of lean mass and a male starts at 70 kilos of lean mass and they both add 10%, the female will have added 4 kilos. The male will have added 7 kilos. The male added 3 kilos more on an absolute level, but as a percentage of their starting lean mass, as a relative amount, they added the same. And then if we look at the strength responses to training, very similar. Bone density, similar. If we look at cardiovascular adaptations, similar. Now, there is some evidence that females may be less fatigable in the gym. And some people have said, oh, well, they should do more high rep training in that case. But the research has shown that women respond the same in terms of percentage of muscle mass from high or low reps. It doesn't seem to matter. And then there's the, well, you need to program around your cycle. You need to program correctly around your cycle. There have been numerous meta-analyses and systematic reviews now that basically show that that's all BS. That you don't need to program around your cycle, that you should, as a female, auto-regulate, meaning if you are someone who knows you feel worse at a certain time, okay, back off a little bit during that time. But I've met women who, like, when they're on their period, they're like, that's when I feel my strongest. That's when I feel my best in the gym. Okay, well then why would you back off on the intensity when you're feeling your best? So I think you should auto-regulate, but I think anybody should auto-regulate. I think males should auto-regulate too. I don't think you need to program around your cycle other than if you don't feel good on a day, use your discretion. Versus if you feel great, also use your discretion. And then with nutrition, I mean, if we look at metabolic rate, people say, well, men have faster metabolisms. Not when you standardize for lean mass. When you look at lean mass, when you standardize for lean mass, women have essentially the same metabolic rate as men. And I know there's the joke out there, like a woman eats nothing but lettuce all week and she gains half a pound, whereas a man cuts out coffee creamer and he loses 10 pounds. That's not really a thing. What women tend to do more, in the research studies, the people who are the biggest underreporters of food are obese women. They underreport food more than any other population. I think there's more shame around food for women. I think there's more focus on body image and being thin. So I'm not saying that this is like completely across the board women's fault. They deal with a lot of pressures that men don't deal with. But they're much more likely to underreport their food intake. But the stuff that works for men for building muscle and losing fat is the same stuff that will work for women. You don't need a special program. You don't need a special diet. What you need to be is consistent. For men who are 50 years and older, what is the optimal amount of sets to build muscle? Well, on the note of things not being that different, age is another thing where when it comes to resistance training, they respond similarly. And in fact, there were some research studies that showed that even like up to age 90, they've shown people build significant muscle mass from resistance training and usually build a similar amount of muscle mass based on their starting lean mass as young men. So I don't think you need to have specialized programs for being older. Like if you've got specific muscle aches, pains that are triggered by certain exercises, you might need to modify exercise selection because of that. But you don't need to program any specific way. In terms of the number of sets that's optimal, that's going to be a very individual basis. But what we do know is from several meta-analyses, it appears for the vast majority of people, the biggest benefits you can get by far are about 10 to 20 sets a week for each body part. Will almost maximize growth. Now, there are some meta-regressions and analysis from James Krieger, who is the editor of my research review Reps. James is a great researcher that suggests that there isn't really a cap on the number of hard sets that produce more growth. But what you have over the course of time is diminishing returns. So I think he's done an analysis of up to like 45 sets a week still produces more growth than say like 20 some sets per week. But the thing to keep in mind is this isn't a linear response. When we say dose dependent, that doesn't mean that you're getting a response in a 1-to-1 ratio. It simply means that as you increase the number, the results increase. But once you get past probably 10, 15, maybe 20 sets a week for a body part, it really starts to be marginal benefits to anything more. But that being said, they have basically shown that there's not really any non-responders to resistance training. There are some people who get a good response from just a few sets per week, and other people need a lot more sets to get the same response. And so people who are genetically predisposed to being able to build muscle can tend to build muscle pretty well on low set number, whereas people who maybe aren't as genetically gifted might need many more sets. But that's going to be the same regardless of age. And so I don't think that I can blanket say across the board that there's a certain set number that after age 50 you need to be hitting. What I will say is for most people, 10 to 20 sets per week per body part appears to be about right in terms of maximizing muscle building or getting the vast majority of the benefits. And then there is some evidence that the individual session muscle protein synthesis, the anabolic response to an individual resistance training session, caps out at around like 8 to 12 sets in a session for a body part. Again, this is very, very, very preliminary data, I would say. But so if that's the case, it makes sense, train a muscle probably like twice a week and, for around 5 to 10 sets in a session. And then you're getting those benefits of the individual sessions as well as the weekly set volumes. But if you look at a forest plot of hypertrophy in response to resistance training and volume, a forest plot has a center line. And for example, like to the right of the center line, this is my right, to the right of the center line, you'll see the average responses for say like higher volumes. To the left of the center line would be the averages for lower volumes. So basically, benefits, lower volume benefits, higher volume, or favors rather. If you look at a forest plot of that, there are some that are on the center line, basically meaning that there was no difference between low and high volume. But there's basically nothing to the left of the center line. Nothing favors low volume. And anything that is one way to the center line is to the right, favoring higher volumes. All that to say, if I had to make a really rough guess, we know that multiple sets per body part are better than a single set. We know that training intensity is the most important variable. You can have a bunch of sets, but if they're not intense enough or close enough to failure, they're not going to be beneficial or nearly as beneficial as intense sets are. And then in terms of intense sets, number of hard sets, again, probably around 10 to 20 sets per week will get you the vast majority of the benefits. And per session, maybe target 5 to 10 sets. What sorts of things negatively affect muscle growth, like ice baths or massage or certain foods, cardio? I mean, there's a lot of things that negatively affect muscle growth. Being sedentary. And even there's evidence that if you are resistance training, that you're better off doing active recovery versus being sedentary for building muscle. It's kind of preliminary data, but I think that that's probably true, that you're better off like being at least moderately or lightly active compared to being sedentary, even if you're resistance training. Ice baths, as you mentioned, cold water immersion or cryotherapy has been shown to reduce the rate of muscle protein synthesis. And in human randomized control trials, people who do cold water immersion regularly build less muscle than people who don't. And I am not a real big fan of cold water immersion. One, I just don't like cold water. But two, the recovery benefits are all benefits that can be had by other modalities that don't have the downside of reducing hypertrophy. So you could do sauna and it has the same recovery benefits as an ice bath, but it's not going to negatively inhibit muscle growth. Other things that inhibit muscle growth, off the top of my head, alcohol. Low doses of alcohol don't, but once you get up into like binge drinking sort of doses, they've shown alcohol will inhibit muscle protein synthesis. It reduces testosterone. It reduces growth hormone. Growth hormone in the physiological range is not really anabolic, but still. So high doses of alcohol will do it. How much is high? I mean, the studies for proof of concept, they go pretty extreme. So I think there was one study that was like 12 drinks in the sitting. And I'm like, man, how did this get past an IRB setting? Are these people getting sick over a toilet? My gosh. But they showed that 12 drinks could negatively inhibit muscle protein synthesis. But I would say, like, typically what I'll tell people is if you're drinking enough to be drunk and feel that effect, you're probably drinking enough to get the negative effects of alcohol. Cigarette smoking. Cigarette smoking appears to negatively affect muscle growth and muscle protein synthesis. And I don't think it's necessarily like the nicotine or the tobacco. I think smoke in general, the tar in smoke, is just overall bad. This probably could be explained by like some differences in acid-base balance or metabolic acid, like slight metabolic acidosis, which is not beneficial for muscle protein synthesis. But even smoking marijuana, I think, is probably going to have similar outcomes. I am not aware of any studies looking at smoking marijuana and muscle growth, but again, I think just the smoke in general is bad for muscle growth. Another thing that may be a little bit surprising to people is non-steroidal anti-inflammatories, NSAIDs like ibuprofen, may actually inhibit muscle hypertrophy and muscle protein synthesis. So when you resistance train and you place mechanical tension on a muscle, part of the process that's involved in muscle tissue remodeling involves inflammatory cytokines. And inhibiting these inflammatory cytokines may actually inhibit muscle growth. So in young people, when they give high doses of NSAIDs, it does attenuate hypertrophy. It reduces the hypertrophy response to resistance training. And you also see this with antioxidants. High dose antioxidants can inhibit anabolic signaling. What's interesting though is in elderly people, the opposite thing happened. There was either no effect of NSAIDs or there was a slight benefit to NSAIDs on muscle hypertrophy. Now this could be indirect, which is if those individuals had less pain, they're able to train harder. But I think what's likely is that there is kind of this U-shape or inverted U-shape for hypertrophy and inflammation, where you have an optimal range of inflammation and too little inflammation is not conducive for hypertrophy and too much inflammation is not conducive for hypertrophy. And so people who are older tend to have higher baseline levels of inflammation. And so perhaps what's happening is in the old, when you give NSAIDs, you are knocking that back into that kind of optimal range. Whereas in the young, they're already in that optimal range and you're knocking them down into a low inflammatory state that's not optimal for building muscle. And again, people hear the word inflammation and they think bad, bad, bad across the board. And that's not really true. Too much inflammation is absolutely bad, especially on a systemic level. But inflammation is an important part of your body's immune system. It's important with tissue remodeling. It serves a very important function. We don't want no inflammation in our bodies. And unfortunately, because inflammation has become such a buzzword for people out there, 99.9% of whom don't even understand what it is, people have thought or had the idea that any kind of inflammation is bad, and that's just not true. Too much inflammation chronically is absolutely bad. But the inflammatory response to exercise is an important component of the adaptations to exercise. And if you inhibit that, you may inhibit some of those adaptations. I mean, I'm sure there's some other medications that can inhibit muscular hypertrophy. High dose corticosteroids probably have a negative effect on muscle mass because they are catabolic. But most people aren't taking those for really, really long periods of time. And like I said, I'm sure there's some other medications that are probably negatives for building muscle. But those are some of the things that I can think of off the top of my head that are pretty common that people do that might be having a negative impact on muscle mass. All right, guys, that's it for the Q&A. I hope you enjoyed it. Now, if you guys are enjoying the podcast, please make sure you leave us a 5-star review wherever you listen to podcasts. If you're watching on YouTube, make sure you thumbs us up. And we appreciate your support. And I am very much enjoying this journey with you all and doing this long form content. And I hope you are enjoying it as well. So until next time, I'm out.